What's going on, fellas? What you just watched there were my deadlifts from yesterday, where after my beltless pause squats, I worked up to 655 for a set of 6. Technique, not gonna lie, pretty amateur. My ability to find and maintain my start position, my patience off the floor, straight amateur. But the strength is pretty good. Old Samwise, I'm coming back, baby. Not that I ever really left, but I'm getting in pretty good condition. My squats are strong right now. My deadlifts are strong right now. My dips are strong right now. My pulling is strong right now. The kind of only thing that's lagging behind a little bit is my vertical pressing power. Well, it's still respectable because pressing has always been a strength of mine. That's the one that's still kind of going a little bit slower to get back to peak condition just due to that rotator cuff strain I had a little bit ago. But we're getting in shape again, baby. Hopefully some big lifts coming soon. So that's kind of what's going on in my neck of the woods. Hopefully going to be doing some heavy dips next week that I'll post up because I know you guys love heavy dips here on YouTube. So I'll share some of mine. But today we're going to do the same kind of general video format we did 2 days ago. We're going to look at some hot takes. We're going to look at a question. And then we're going to have a little open community talk about something, which we are going to get to later. So I decided we were going to do a 2-for-1 today on the controversial lifting opinions. So we're going to look at them. We're going to see if we're going to give out the coveted hot take award. To fit the criteria, as always, for a hot take award, it's got to be genuinely controversial among people that kind of know what they're talking about, and I got to agree with it. So the first one that we are going to look at opinions-wise is dumbbell pressing is overrated because the loading is difficult, they are less stable, and the range of motion is more limited unless you're using bitch weights. Therefore, they're only good for avoiding overuse injuries. By Up Plates 48. All right, Up Plates 48. I'm coming for your neck here. I don't agree with you at all. I'm a big fan of dumbbells. So we're going to go kind of one by one through those criticisms of dumbbell work, and I'll let you know my thoughts on them. So one, they are less stable. That is true, but one could argue that is a benefit of the exercise, right? Other than the argument that, oh, we've got this freedom of movement. You kind of touched on, okay, sure, they could be viable for avoiding an overuse injury because we have this freedom of movement. It might not be as taxing on the wrists, shoulders, and elbows. Sure, but that aside, the one deviation less stable might be driving a unique strength effect. At least in my experience, when I'm relatively strong on a dumbbell bench press, the negative on my regular bench press feels locked in. And I would argue that the slight deviation, less instability, is a benefit. I wouldn't say it's so unstable that it's wildly limiting our loads. We should be able to kind of rein in that stability pretty easily once we've trained with them for a little bit. Loading is difficult. Sure, we've got a little bit bigger jumps between weights. I could see that. But if you get the technique down, kicking them up into place isn't hard, if that's what you mean. I'm not really sure what you mean by loading is difficult. Yeah, we got a little bit bigger increments between what we can load, but getting them into place is easy enough. They are less stable. And the range of motion is more limited unless you're using bitch weights. Well, I don't think I'm using bitch weights, but I'm about to blow your mind, about to change your life. So we have the dumbbells like this. They're kind of running parallel here. All we have to do is we rotate them a little bit like this, and then suddenly, no matter how big the dumbbell is, we can get a pretty big range of motion. I've done 170s like this, and I can actually get a greater range of motion than I would with a barbell. Where a barbell would hit my chest, and I don't have to pause and come back up. I can row them further than that when we rotate them to this 45-degree angle or more towards neutral, kind of depending on your preference. We're actually able to actively row past our chest line, which is where I find a ton of value in them, both as a hypertrophy stimulus, this added range of motion we can get out of dumbbells, as well as a strength stimulus. It's almost like a deficit bench press where we don't have that stability of our sternum at the bottommost position. We're having to pause below that point, load this very stretched position of the pecs, kind of let that elastic tension dissipate, create power from a dead stop where we can't heave the dumbbells up because there's no point of contact. So I think the dumbbell bench press is a phenomenal bench accessory, specifically when we do them where we kind of rotate our hands to 45 degrees, we're rowing them in a bit at the bottom, keeping our back tight, setting into whatever amount of arch we use on our comp bench, pausing, creating power out of the bottom, going pretty heavy. I've always gotten great returns from them. So Up Plates 48. Up them dumbbells. So the other one we're going to look at, not related at all, is from TWR74. Deadlift bars are cheating. Squat bars were developed for the safety of the lifter, whereas deadlift bars are strictly for performance improvement. That's an interesting point. Right off the bat, controversial. Right off the bat, I kind of agree with you. If you said, Sam, deadlift bars are going to be taken off the face of the planet, even though I use one so I could lift more weight, you would not hear me complain. I would love if we were all lifting on the same level playing field. I tend to agree. It only really exists for this reason of letting people lift more weight. And it kind of opens up this big problem for the sport of powerlifting, which is making it so lifters of the past cannot be directly compared to current lifters, which is already a massive problem due to the rapidly changing equipment of, okay, well, we went from raw to we went to single ply. Then we went to really beefy single ply, where the early single ply, we could debate how much those were helping. Then we went to most lifting was happening multiply for a period of time, or at least on the untested side, then tested with single ply, but there was not that much raw lifting going on. Then it was raw with wraps. Then now it was raw with sleeves. And now the sleeves are getting more beefy. And at some point the deadlift bar was added in. So it's very hard to make direct comparisons as you might be able to in weightlifting. Yes, there's changes in drug testing status across time in weightlifting, but we can kind of say, well, a clean and jerk is a clean and jerk. The rules haven't really changed. The beneficial equipment hasn't really changed. Okay, we can kind of make, to some degree, an apples to apples comparison of how much weight is being performed. So it opens up just another avenue to kind of mess up that comparison when there's different brands of deadlift bar, kabuki bar, that's then not what the previous records were broken on. And suddenly when this new bar comes out, records fall left and right. Is that really that people are making progression within the sport, which is what we're trying to measure, or is it that we're changing the standard to which we are lifting, right? So yada, yada, yada. I agree. That being said, I do think there's a little bit of a flaw in your rationale being, oh, well, the deadlift bar was created strictly for performance. Well, whereas the squat bar was created for lifter safety. Well, let's see. Heeled squat shoes were created for performance, not for lifter safety, but I reckon those should be allowed. Knee wraps were actually made for lifter safety, not for performance, because at the period of time, people thought it was your knees were going to get destroyed squatting without sufficient support. So because they were made with the intention of, because they were made with the intention of safety and extra weight was a byproduct, following that rationale of the intention is what should dictate whether it's cheating or not. The squat suit was made initially as a lifter safety kind of thing. And they would, if you listen to old kind of info things about like powerlifting covered in the news, they're like, oh, the lifters wear these super suits because no lifter would ever dare to lift these weights without the assistance of these like things to make sure they don't fall apart. Right? Since then, we've kind of changed our opinions, but that was the actual rationale back in the day. I mean, monolifts came out and the initial pitch was lifter safety to some degree. So I don't think the initial rationale should factor in, but I agree with your conclusion. Certified hot take award. I know Max would agree. Max would love if powerlifting was nothing but stiff bars, tested, untested. We could make that comparison without having to factor in the deadlift bar, the different brands of deadlift bars. I tend to agree. Does it feel nice to pull on a deadlift bar? Does it feel nice to pull a little extra weight? Absolutely. So I do it. We get to use them in strongman most of the time, so I practice on it. But you would hear no complaints from me if they disappeared tonight. Now, for the question of the day, it's actually one I got over on the Patreon, which you're welcome to join. You don't have to. The content is going to be free. It's not going to be behind a paywall ever. I like putting YouTube info out there because that's where I got a lot of what I know today was from various YouTube channels, and I would like to kind of put back into that. Now that I feel I kind of know what I'm talking about, now that I make my living as a coach, I would like to kind of put back into what I drew from. But that being said, I do have a Patreon to support the channel, and I try to answer all lifting related questions, even if it is kind of specific to you. Whereas you'll see, even when we do the big question answering videos here on the channel, I like to answer questions that are going to help a broad variety of people, or at least I can riff off of them into a greater training topic. I'm not going to answer your question of like, hey, I'm 15 years old and I just did this program and I'm transitioning to this program. Can I modify the frequency? Don't know what people are going to take away from that. So you're always welcome to send me that kind of thing on Patreon. I try to get back to you in 24 or 48 hours. I try to check it every day, every other day. Happy to answer all lifting related questions. I got one that I thought would be kind of interesting one to touch on. One of the guys on the Patreon actually sent me one of Bromley's videos from about 3 years ago, which I actually saw it 3 years ago. So it wasn't my first time seeing it. But it was Bromley giving a review of 3 kind of uncommon exercises, right? Kind of ranging in how common they are and how he kind of felt that all 3 were a little bit overrated. And this guy sent it to me and he said, hey, what do you think of this? You know, these are 3 exercises I kind of see people doing. Bromley doesn't really like them all that much. What are your thoughts? And we're going to go through. Bromley, if you watch this, I apologize. I'm going to kind of skim over your points. You're welcome to go watch this video. basically just to mostly to get to my opinions on these exercises, kind of touch on some of Bromley's talking points, but I don't have them in front of me, so spare me. Give me some leeway here. So the first one was SSB front squats, where we kind of flip the SSB around, we come into it. Lots of people will propose this as a more comfortable way to front squat. They're like, oh, I've got issues with dropping the bar where it's uncomfortable and it's choking me out. So I just do my front squats on the SSB, but it's the same thing. Bromley's talking points were basically just look at where an SSB places the center of mass. If you flip around the SSB, it's placing that center of mass behind you, which is largely going to defeat the training stimulus we're looking to get from front squats. We're more using an SSB the regular way is more akin to a front squat with that load being displaced in front of us, placing those big demands on the quads and those thoracic extensor muscles, than flipping it around into a front squat setting. And I tend to agree with Bromley's conclusion there. No, it does not mimic a front squat. No, this isn't an equal substitute where we're going to get the same benefits. It's a completely different exercise. I could see a use for it, and by I could see a use for it, I mean specifically Kevin Oak, multiple time 220 and 242, all-time total and squat record holder, would use the SSB front squat sometimes in his training. And if you heard his rationale, it was basically that his lower back was pretty fried. Being a guy with a longer torso, shorter limbs, he was always kind of having to struggle with managing his lower back training economy. He felt that the SSB front squat let him expose his legs to a very heavy load while being negligibly taxable compared to squatting that weight raw on the lower back, which, okay, sure, I could see that. Because you can, with an equal training, you're going to do way more on an SSB front squat because that weight is behind you. It's unfathomably easier once you get accustomed to the exercise when compared to a traditional front squat. So he was able to go up in excess of 700 pounds and expose his legs to relevant squat pattern weight while being somewhat sparing on the lower back. I've done them because it's kind of pulling you backwards the whole time. Quite challenging on the abs, not so challenging on the low back. So I could see his specific special use case. Maybe you could play around with it if that's your reason, but if the goal is to duplicate the benefits of a real front squat, no, it doesn't fit the bill. I agree 100% with Bromley on this one. Now, the next one was the Z press, where you're kind of seated on the floor, feet spread out in front of you, and we are going to do overhead presses that way. If I remember Bromley's talking points, God, this is the one I'm going to botch a little bit because I mostly was organizing my own thoughts in response to this guy's question, but it's not relevant to, especially for strongmen. Usually we are going to be utilizing leg drive, and the majority of the time, if I remember, Bromley's talking point is that we should either be practicing the use of that leg drive and that coordination of the whole body, or we should be maximally taxing the shoulders in a more supported seating setting. So we're either looking to work our whole body in the kind of more sport-specific pattern of an overhead press with leg drive, or we are trying to work the shoulders to their absolute maximal capacity in something like a seated high incline or a seated overhead press. And that the Z press is just this unstable, self-limiting bastard version of the two. And I kind of see where he's coming from there. I probably am a little bit nicer to the Z press than Bromley is. I don't know if he's updated his opinion since, but we can look at a couple of things. It does a very good job building overhead press relative trunk strength, especially in the core. It can teach people how to kind of brace for an overhead press rather than overhead press from an extended position. So I can see its place as a learning tool. It is pretty self-limiting, and that's why usually wherever I would ever program a Z press, I usually favor the no back support seated overhead press. It doesn't have the mobility demands. It doesn't have the chronic hip flexor cramping, and it is slightly less self-limiting because we can create a little bit of stability with our feet on the ground. So it is significantly less self-limiting, and it's basically just an ultra strict overhead press. And I could see an argument for this one. So yeah, okay, I'm not a huge fan of the Z press either, mostly because I feel that the no back support seated overhead press does most of what it does, but better. And that's going to be drilling a very pure vertical pressing pattern, whereas doing maximal, very heavy, very close to failure overhead presses rewards a little bit of layback. You get this feedback loop of, oh, if I lay back, it's better. If I lay back, it's better. But you don't probably, if you're a competitive strongman and your goal is your overhead press with leg drive, you probably don't want to over reward that lay back pattern. We want to be using our strict press as a supplement for our push press. So rather than using the strict press technique that's going to let us hit the biggest strict numbers possible, we probably want to use the strict press technique that is going to best mirror the function of our shoulders during the push press. And that's going to be more of a pure vertical pressing pattern. And lots of people, you could say, oh, we'll just do your overhead presses more strict. Sure, fair enough, but lots of people are so far down that rabbit hole of hard rep equals lay back that they need to have something that's going to punish that motor pattern to help them relearn that mechanic. And that's where I can find a no back support seated overhead press really shines, is teaching people how to do a really hard rep without that automatically meaning laying back. And it can also, I think it's self-limiting, but it's not so self-limiting that the weights are irrelevant. So it can be used on a tertiary day where we're a bit fatigued. So I agree with Bromley. Not a huge fan of the Z press. I would basically always use a no back support seated overhead press in its place. Though I think Bromley might raise some of those same criticisms of the no back support seated overhead press, I will advocate for it. I definitely see some merit in it. I've seen some success with it, especially in breaking that habit of maximal presses overhead automatically equating to layback. So the last one was the pendlay row. Now, this one was very interesting because he talked about how the way he saw it, it was created as a weightlifting supplemental movement. Part of the reason weightlifters can train so often is because there isn't really an eccentric phase, and the pendlay row doesn't necessarily have a eccentric phase. And basically, his thoughts were, hey, this is a really good exercise, but I feel most of the time people are going to be better served doing a more traditional barbell row, where they're working that capacity of lower back. They are using an eccentric, which is probably going to build more muscle. And they're challenging that skill of staying tight for an extended period of time, because that is an area that most people need a lot of help in. And I can see all of those talking points. I will say that he talked about like, oh, you know, like some exercises we have an eccentric, then a concentric. Well, the deadlift, which presumably we might be doing the pendlay row as a deadlift assisted movement, also is coming dead stop from the floor and also doesn't necessarily contain an eccentric. And I think you could make an argument that overcoming a dead stop weight on the floor is a skill, and that some people could benefit from building that skill into as many avenues of their training as physically possible. This idea of tensing ourselves against a dead weight, creating tension, and then creating force, rather than being able to use an eccentric to pull us into the perfect position. That's a skill that we could probably challenge by swapping our RDLs to dead stop stiff legs, and we could probably challenge by swapping our regular rows to pendlay rows. If someone really does struggle with this idea of tensing ourselves against a dead weight, which I would argue, just as much as people struggle to keep tension across time, I would say they also struggle with this idea of creating tension while they're not moving. I think that's very, very different than any real sports background, and it's a very lifting specific skill that people are going to have to spend a lot of time developing. So I guess I probably have a little bit more of a soft spot for some lifters who really do need to work on the idea of overcoming a dead stop, whereas like, okay, well, my RDL numbers look decent, my row numbers look decent, but I'm not really putting that together into a very technically proficient deadlift. Obviously, deadlifting is going to be the name of the game. We need to do specific practice to get better at it, but I think there are ways we can leverage our accessories to better aid us in that goal of mastering that main lift, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I don't necessarily disagree with Bromley. I do think that a lot of people use them just because they can use a lot of weight, tugging it off the floor, coasting. They're not actually even challenging the concentric of their lats that much, let alone the eccentric. But that being said, I would critique the exercise off of it done well rather than critique it off of people doing it badly. Because I could also say regular barbell rows, I see people doing them horrendously, but I wouldn't make the criticism of that. I would make the criticism off of someone doing it very well. In which case I would say, A, when you're doing a pendlay row well, you could absolutely control the eccentric, and I don't think that's an inherent critique of the exercise itself. And B, I would say that idea of repeatedly re-bracing and overcoming a dead stop is just as beneficial as the ability to kind of maintain tension, at least in my eyes. So I guess that would be the one I disagree the most on. Not that I don't see a tremendous amount of value in the regular barbell row as a developmental tool. I also see a tremendous amount of value in the pendlay row as a developmental tool. Thank you guys for watching.